Good afternoon. I'm Mr. Bryan. I'm an 11th grade U.S. history teacher at Mary G. Montgomery High School. This week, we're going to be looking at World War II, and specifically the Alabama State Standard number 10, where we're talking about the impact of World War II on the lives of Americans. So know this at the beginning of the war, as we start this lesson, we're talking about the beginning of the war, that in America we're going through a Great Depression, that we're going through a New Deal that President FDR has began producing, and we're really focused on that. We're turned inward, we're turned to ourselves. So this lesson is going to be all about how the war begins and how we move from that neutrality to getting involved in declaring war. So our essential question today is going to be, how did the rise of dictators contribute to the outbreak of World War II? Our objective is we're going to be looking at two. We're going to analyze America's decision to implement a program called Lend-Lease, and we're also going to trace the cause of the United States declaration of war, because it took something for us to go from neutrality and isolation to declaring war. So we're going to look at those things today. Okay? So before we get started, or as we're getting started, let's look at these totalitarian leaders, and let's define that term first. A totalitarian leader is somebody who leads a country who has total control. They're not rivaled. They make the decisions of the country. They have absolute power. So I have three individuals on the smart board. The first one is Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. Now, we've learned in the past, you've learned in your classroom in the past about World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution and how Vladimir Lenin took control of Russia and it became the Soviet Union. Well, in 1924, Joseph Stalin is going to take over at the death of Vladimir Lenin. You're also going to see him intensify his communist control in the Soviet Union, in Russia. So as we move on, let's define what communism is. So it's an economic and political system based on a one-party government and state ownership of property. So you don't see private ownership of property, you don't see people going to the polls and voting, you see a government-controlled society. The next guy that we have on the screen, his name is Benito Mussolini. He forcefully overthrew the Italian government, and he did that by marching on Rome with his supporters. So he takes control forcefully. He begins building a military, and he begins invading countries such as Ethiopia pretty quickly. Now, his government structure is called fascism. Fascism exalts the nation and the race above the individual. It's a government that's ran by a dictator who has absolute power and who is oppressive. So again, promoting, exalting the nation above the individual. That's what we see within fascism. Strong form of government. The next one on the screen you see is Adolf Hitler, and if you've ever done any study with World War II, you've probably come across his name or have heard about him and things of that nature. So with Adolf Hitler, his government system is called Nazism. Now, he rose to power through party politics. It's a long story that we're going to condense, and as a result of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, we saw that the treaty embarrassed Germany. It was really harsh on Germany. Their economy was in shambles. They couldn't have a standing military, and the German people were looking for somebody to reestablish Germany. So Adolf Hitler was the guy who came in and promised to do those things. So again, he just slowly rose up through party politics. Now, to define Nazism, which was his form of government, is a political philosophy similar to fascism, but it's based on extreme nationalism, racism, military expansion. And you're going to see him do a lot of these things as he comes into power. He is exalting the Nazi Germany above the individual. He believes in racial superiority, and he communicates that, as we saw, through the Holocaust, where he systematically murdered 6 million Jews. So that's going to continue throughout the duration of World War II. So you have these totalitarian leaders, these three mainly in Europe, and because of their actions, you're going to see the war escalate and begin. Now, this next slide deals with German advances, and it's really hard to see some of the dates on this slide with the arrows pointing to different countries, but I can tell you the brief story based on this document. If you'll watch and follow along with me, you can see below Germany, you can see Austria. So as he's beginning to invade, he invades Austria first, and here's his mentality. He builds this military, and he builds it quickly, and he builds it as strong as he can, and he believes that he's going to acquire living space for the German people. He called that Lebensraum, to this idea that he wants all Germans living in Germany, but it's not that he's going to send a postcard to the people of Europe saying, hey, why don't you move back to Germany? No, his mentality is, I'm going to bring Germany to a town near you. So he invades Austria. He then begins invading Czechoslovakia. Now, at first he says, well, give me just the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, called the Sudetenland. But as you'll see, that he breaks that promise to just invade that, invades the rest of Czechoslovakia. He enters with Russia, the Soviet Union, into a 10-year peace pact to both invade Poland at one time. Now, Hitler, in doing that, he was being careful. He was trying to make sure that he had peace in the East against the Soviet Union so they would not invade him. So this peace pact was twofold. It was to invade Poland, but it was also so that he could turn westward and invade France and fight in the West. So he invades Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and then he's going to move into France, and quickly he will take over France. Right? So as we get to this point, the Axis powers are going to be, in Europe especially, Germany and Italy. We're going to talk about Japan in a second, who's another member of the Axis powers. But they've invaded most of Europe. They've taken over most of Europe. In fact, they've even taken over a lot of North Africa. So this is the most land that you see the Axis powers having conquered during this time. Now, the only country that is left that was a member of the League of Nations is Great Britain. Now, if you'll remember back to the World War I lessons, that the League of Nations was proposed as a peacekeeping international organization. And it was put in place to do that, but it hadn't done its job. They did not step in to stop Hitler. They did not mobilize for defense or anything. They allowed him step by step to do a lot of what he did in Europe. So Great Britain, being the last League of Nations member that's fighting, that's not conquered by the Nazis, you see Hitler begin but bombing London and Great Britain. So they begin this bombing crusade, and at this point, again, they are one of the last European countries that are left to fight Hitler. And that's kind of where we find the United States. So this next slide, we're going to go to it and we're going to read some documents and look at some documents. But before I get there, I really need to explain a few things to you. So after World War I, America turned inward for a variety of reasons, but we turn inward. And what that's called, where we're not worried about the world, it's called neutrality. We want to stay to ourselves, but it's also called isolationism. We want to stay isolated to our own continent, to our own nation, and focus on ourselves and not the problems of the world. That's the reason we didn't join the League of Nations. And our president, Woodrow Wilson, proposed the League of Nations. The world adopted it, but we didn't join, because we felt that if we joined, that it could pull us into conflicts. It's kind of like hanging around the wrong group of friends at school. As they get into conflicts and you're good friends with them, you'll get into the same conflicts. So we wanted to stay to ourselves. That's called American isolationism. So what I want to look at is a couple of documents on the smartboard. The one on the left is a text document by David Kennedy. And he says this about American isolation. He says, no people came to believe more emphatically than the Americans that the Great War, which was World War I, was an absolute tragedy, an unpardonably costly mistake never to be repeated. More than 50,000 American doughboys, which were soldiers, had perished fighting on the Western Front, and to what avail? So far from being redeemed by American intervention, Europe swiftly slid back into its historic vices of authoritarianism and armed rivalry, while America slid back into its historic attitude of isolationism. Isolationism may have been most pronounced in the landlocked Midwest, but Americans of both sexes, of all ages, religions, and political persuasions, from all ethnic groups and regions, shared in the post-war years a feeling of apathy toward Europe. Not to mention the rest of the wretchedly quarrelsome world that bordered on disgust. Let us turn our eyes inward, declared Pennsylvania's liberal Democratic Governor George Earle in 1935. If the world is to become a wilderness of waste, hatred, and bitterness, let us all the more earnestly protect and preserve our own oasis of liberty. Now notice in there some of the things he's talking about. We're turning inward as Europe is doing what they have done in the past. We're going to preserve what we have here, our own oasis of liberty. We're focused on ourselves, not the world. We're putting ourselves first and turning inward. I want you to look at the cartoon on the board. I always have students analyze cartoons in my classroom. I think it's great. So this cartoon might look familiar, not so much because you've seen it before, but just the way the pictures are drawn. So if you'll see, this looks a lot like a Dr. Seuss image, because it is. Dr. Seuss drew some political cartoons. So if you'll look at the bed on the left, we see Uncle Sam drawn laying in the bed by himself, and he has this thought, what a lucky thing we have separate beds. Now if you'll look at the bed to your right, it's labeled Europe. And in it, you see these children, there's smoke coming up, maybe that represents smell or disease or something. But if you look above each child, you have these labels. You have the Stalin itch. You have the Hitler-itis. And we talked about Stalin, we've talked about Hitler, Blitzpox. Blitzkrieg was a type of warfare that the Nazis used called lightning war, Blitzkrieg. So you see that. Nazi fever, we've talked about the Nazis. Fascist fever, we've talked about them. Italian mumps at the bottom of the screen. So what I would conclude, and hopefully you as well as you're looking at it with me, that these are the problems and the diseases and the issues and the totalitarian governments in Europe. And we're in our own bed and we're separate and we're happy about that. We have turned inward. And this was, again, the mentality of America in both world wars. World War I initially, and especially World War II at the very beginning. We do not want to get involved. Okay? I'm going to go to the next slide and just kind of introduce something that FDR saw as an issue. He saw Great Britain sitting by themselves in Europe fighting Adolf Hitler, fighting the Nazis. We're not helping. We're in our own oasis of liberty. We're isolationists. We've kept to ourselves. It's just us. And Britain is fighting alone. The Nazis are bombing London. They're tearing London to shreds. So FDR saw an issue where we needed to help. Now, we had policies in place. Initially, we had a policy called the Neutrality Acts, where we're not trading war goods with anybody. We then had cash and carry. We're staying neutral. If you want war goods, come to the United States, put cash on the table, and we will give you the war goods. But FDR saw that this neutrality and this form of aid was not enough. And he said this. Let's look at the document. Here's what the President proposed. He said, I also ask this Congress for authority and for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds, to be turned over to those nations which are now in actual war with aggressor nations. Our most useful and immediate role is to act as an arsenal for them as well as for ourselves. They do not need manpower, but they do need billions of dollars worth of the weapons of defense. The time is near when they will not be able to pay for them all in ready cash. We cannot and we will not tell them they must surrender merely because of present inability to pay for the weapons which we know they must have. So if you'll notice in there, he's explaining the necessity, the need for help. As they're fighting, they don't have the weapons and they don't have the money to put cash on the table. They need something more. They need us to lend them weapons. So FDR knew that he was speaking to an isolationist America, a neutral America. As he makes this statement, he makes other examples. He says, well, let's say your neighbor's house is burning down and you have this 150-foot water hose. You just bought it at the store. It's perfect condition. It's great. But your neighbor's house is burning down and they say, hey, lend me your hose so that I can extinguish the fire, right? Would you say to them, and this is kind of the way that FDR is explaining it, would you say to them, no, pay me the money to rent it. That way I know that if you damage it, I've got money to go buy another one, and then you can go put the fire out that's burning your house down right now. No, you take your water hose, your brand new one that you got at the store, you plug it into their faucet, and you extinguish the fire with them. And he even said, let's say that the water hose is damaged. Well, you figure that out later, after the fact. But you move to help your neighbor who's in need. So this is FDR proposing, hey, we need to adopt this Lend-Lease policy. But know this, that even as he's proposing that there are people that disagree with him. So let's look at the board, there's two documents. One on the left says this: war is not inevitable for this country. Such a claim is defeatism in the true sense. No one can make us fight abroad unless we ourselves are willing to do so. No one will attempt to fight us here if we arm ourselves as a great nation should be armed. Over 100 million people in this nation are opposed to entering the war. If the principles of democracy mean anything at all, this is reason enough for us to stay out. If we are forced into a war against the wishes of an overwhelming majority of our people, we will have proved democracy such a failure at home that there will be little use fighting for it abroad. Now, if you'll look at the cartoon beside it, it's a cartoon explaining neutrality, but it's also being critical of those who opposed Lend-Lease and said that we needed to be neutral. Now, if you take the document that we just read, notice some of the concerns this mentioned. That the fact that it's going to cost the American taxpayer, but get this, that if the war in Europe continues, it could threaten the United States. And in Lend-Lease, what are we doing? We're giving our defense, our arms, our weapons to another country. So we're weakening our defense system in the process of helping them when it could threaten us. So there were a lot of Americans that were saying, no, we do not need to adopt Lend-Lease. But this cartoon, again, is critical of that. If you'll look, it's another Dr. Seuss cartoon. I tried to incorporate two of those this lesson. It's a bird, and he's sitting on top of a tree. He represents the United States. You can see the hat, the Stars and Stripes hat on his head. But there's this woodpecker going from tree to tree to tree, and he's got the swastika on him, meaning he's a Nazi Germany woodpecker. You can see Norway and Greece and France and Poland and all these trees that have been cut down. These trees, as you can tell, represent countries. Well, this woodpecker's now on the tree labeled England, and the tree's about to go down. It's on its last leg. They need our help. But if you'll see here, the bird representing the United States says, ho-hum, when he's finished pecking down that last tree, he'll quite likely be tired and he won't mess with me. So this cartoon is, again, it's a pointed message. It's speaking to isolationists and it's saying, no, we need to aid Britain now. It is time. Okay, so a few more documents. We won't necessarily read all of this one. Let's at least look at the beginning of it. This is speaking of Lend-Lease, and it's speaking again of why the United States should get involved. It says, it has been said times without number, if Hitler cannot cross the English Channel, he can't cross 3,000 miles of sea. But there is only one reason why he has not crossed the English Channel. That is because 45 million determined Britons in heroic resistance have converted their island into an armed base from which proceeds a steady stream of sea and air power. As Secretary Hollis said, it is not the water that bars the way, it is the resolute determination of the British arms. Were the control of the seas, and listen to this closely, were the control of the seas by Britain lost, the Atlantic would no longer be an obstacle. Rather, it would become a broad highway for a conqueror moving westward. Notice that if they fall, then the Atlantic Ocean is no task. Hitler can easily invade and come toward the United States. So this neutrality, this isolationism is weakening in the United States as we're moving closer and closer toward joining the war. Here's what FDR said: we must be a great arsenal of democracy around the world. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war. So we are neutral. We have not joined the war. We are not technically fighting. We have not declared war. But we're going to be an arsenal of democracy. We are picking sides, and we are pouring our support to Britain and to the Allies to help however we can. We're doing everything we can. The United States adopts the policy of Lend-Lease, and this next chart shows you at the end of the war, so we're going 1941 through 45, where all of our aid went, how much money we were able to give in weapons and defense. You can see Great Britain got over 31 million. You can see that Russia, they will later become an ally and fight on our side. Russia, over 10 million, close to 11 million, as well as other countries. You can look on that chart and see where all of this aid's going, but we do adopt a policy of Lend-Lease. Okay? So what I want to do now we've analyzed how we adopted that policy, and we've seen all of the different aspects of that. What I want to do is go across the ocean to the other side of the world, and I want to quickly look at what Japan's doing, because this is the story of how we really declared war. We've now done an about-face. We're moving toward involvement, but we're not there. Something has to happen, and that something will be Pearl Harbor. But to get to that story, let me show you a couple of slides. So Japan has this same mentality of Adolf Hitler. Remember, they're allies, and they began invading countries throughout Asia. If you'll remember back when you were in school, when you were in class, you studied Chapter 10, American Expansion, and how European countries are conquering lands in the Pacific. Well, in this map, you can see they're expanding and reconquering those lands. So French Indochina, all that's conquered by the French. They invade that area. We had the territory, if you'll remember, we have the territory of the Philippines. They invade the Philippines, and we have to leave. And we leave troops behind, and we leave people behind as we're trying to get out. You'll see the Bataan Death March in that island chain as well. So they expand. This is called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. It's a mouthful, but it speaks to expansion of Japan, the Japanese Empire, throughout the Pacific. Now, moving on to the next slide, what begins to happen, this is where we hit Pearl Harbor. We told Japan to stop expanding because they're taking over the Philippines. They're threatening other U.S. territories in the Pacific. We say stop expanding. So we put forth a policy to cut all oil trade to Japan. Well, Japan was dependent on that oil trade. So as we cut that trade, they began planning the attack on Pearl Harbor. So very quickly, December 7th, 1941, 180 warplanes, 6 aircraft carriers, make it toward the Hawaiian Islands, do the attack on Pearl Harbor. This was a Sunday morning. It was peaceful before the attack, but 2,403 Americans are killed, 1,178 are injured. This sent a shockwave through the United States. People are realizing that now their brothers and their cousins and their dads are going to fight, and they're going to go overseas, and they're going to be gone for a long time, and they might not return. At this, the president makes this statement. He says, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I've directed that all measures be taken for our defense. No matter how long it may take us to overcome the premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to the absolute victory. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us, God. Now I want you to notice in there, I want you to notice the good and evil aspect. The fact that the president spoke and the president said that there is a moral side to this fight and there is an immoral side, and Americans knew it. And that's next week's lesson. The fact that we are going to be able to mobilize for defense. Guys, you might have a European campaign and a Pacific campaign, but you also have a campaign at home. And if you don't win the loyalty of the American people, if the American people do not get behind the war effort and support it and go to work and join the military and buy war bonds and do all of these things, we're not going to be successful. So, with that being said, again, next week is how America mobilized, how we fought the war, and how the war impacted the lives of Americans. I'll see you next week.